So I'm going to tell you just kind of really quick, the goal of this next little bit is to, like Andrew said, to kind of introduce you all to the concept of framing, what it is, how it works, and to do that in a way that is in service of pointing out the ways that it can be helpful in your work. And so that's my goal, is that we get to, in the next 20 minutes, an understanding of this concept of framing, and really a specific understanding of the role that it can play in the work that you do and the impacts and the effects that you're trying to have. I'm going to start just by telling you a little bit more about myself, not that you all care or should care, but that it's actually kind of important in the work that I'm going to be talking about. So I am, by training, a psychological anthropologist, and what that means is that I study culture and how it influences the way that people think, how people use culture in mind to make meaning of messages, to make sense of issues, and to formulate and reach decisions. And I get to do that work. I've got one other colleague who you're going to be hearing from in a little bit, Marissa Gerstein-Pinot, who's on right now. There's about 30 other folks at the Frameworks Institute, most of whom are social scientists like myself and Marissa, people who are anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, political scientists, linguists. And what we do is we study mindsets, cultural mindsets. So the ways that people implicitly, without knowing it, make sense of the information that we put in front of them, and then framing, how the way that we put information in front of people has the ability to influence and shape those mindsets. And so I'm going to start off by defining, kind of giving you a sense of what this concept of framing looks like. And I'm going to do that. This is going to seem really weird as soon as I switch this slide, so everybody be ready for it. It's about to get a little bit weird here. I'm going to do that with these cows. Okay, so here's the deal. This works much better when we're in person, but I think it's going to work in Zoom as well. Don't worry, Andrew, it's going to work. So the idea here is, if I told you that this cow in the foreground, Bessie, which I think is like the American quintessential name for a cow, I've been told. If I told you Bessie was sick, and I asked you why Bessie is sick, what would you say? And this is the time you can throw your ideas in the chat. I can't see the chat, but I'm going to try to see the chat there. Now I can see the chat. What would you say? Love to hear what people think, and I'll keep talking as you fill that in. Normally, when I do this in person, you get the kind of answers that are like, well, it's probably, maybe Daisy, this cow over here in the background. I think Daisy is another quintessential cow name, is sick, and Bessie got sick from Daisy. Or people would say, maybe there's something that got sprayed on this grass, or the wild and crazy orthogonal thinkers would say maybe it's Farmer Brown in the background left some of his trash out, and Bessie got into the trash. Right, so you generate a set of answers to that question based on what you can see. So what if I did this, and then I asked you the same question? I'm hoping that this is not too kind of painfully obvious what I've just done there, that your answers would be quite different, that you would point to the pollution, to the smoke, to the smog, to the air particulates that are going on in that background as the most likely reason for why Bessie is sick. And so what this is here, I've just shown you, is an example of framing. So the aperture, the lens, the focus that we're given on an issue, and how that influences what we think, how we feel about an issue, and importantly, what we come up with as the viable solutions to a problem. And so for the next, however long we have together today, I'd like to propose a shared definition of framing that we can all use kind of constructively as some common ground, and hopefully that you can take forward and use with you as you come out of this, what I think is going to be a really fascinating, important, and interesting hours together here that we spend. Is that when we talk about framing, what we're talking about is the choices that we all make when we present information. And those can be like really big, obvious choices, the values that we advance, that we use to explain why an issue matters, fairness or justice or opportunity. It could be the metaphors that we choose and that we use to explain how our issue works. Brain architecture, for example, as a way to explain how brain development works in early childhood. But it's also really important to acknowledge that framing is also in the kind of micro language choices we make, in the nuances of the words that we use. So for example, it's in the pronouns that we choose. If we talk about they, them, those people over there experiencing problems, and we over here, an hour, or whether we talk collectively using different pronouns to kind of connote common ground and shared benefits. It's all of those choices, big and small. And it's also, I would argue, as you just saw from the cows on the previous slide, it's not just about words, it's also about the visuals that we choose and how all of those decisions affect how people think, kind of what they understand, what they take away from our information, how they feel emotionally, how they engage or don't as a result of what it is we have to say, and how they act, the decisions that they make after hearing what it is we have to say. And so I'm going to give you, if cows were not convincing enough, which they may not have been, I think they work for me, but I'm going to give you one more quick example that shows what framing is all about and what it can do. And I'm going to do that by talking about this really interesting study that was conducted by a group of, can you guess it based on the title of the slide, Danish political scientists. And I think that any slide that begins with this title is just bound to be kind of utterly awesome. This is my favorite titled slide that I have in any presentation. So these Danish politicians took a sample of these Danish political scientists took a sample of 964 Danish politicians. These are kind of like local municipal level decision makers. And they divided them into two groups. So group number one received information about the performance of two schools. And the schools were labeled, fictitious Danish sounding name number one, and fictitious Danish sounding name number two. And then these politicians were asked to do two things. They were asked to remember the data, kind of a basic recall task, and then they were asked to interpret it, to extend it, to work from those data to a conclusion that was kind of advanced or inferred from the data. And these were Danish politicians. They did great. They remembered it, and they were really good at the interpretation. They worked from the data and kind of all, or relatively all, reached the conclusion that was clearly suggested by the data. So the second half of this group of 964 Danish politicians received the same data, exactly the same message, except for one thing. Instead of fictitious Danish sounding name number one and fictitious Danish sounding name number two, the two schools were labeled as being either public or private. And in Denmark, that is a significant ideological cue, right? It cues identity and divides people into their respective conservative or liberal progressive camps. This group of policymakers did the same thing, recall and interpretation, and they sucked. They were horrible, but they weren't kind of haphazardly horrible. They were horrible in the direction that their political ideology would predict. So they took the information and they used it to advance their particular bent, their particular pre-existing position on this issue of education, kind of a classic example of motivated reasoning. Now, these researchers, like I imagine some of us on this call have done before, certainly some of my colleagues on this call have probably done before, certainly I have done before, thought the problem is we just didn't give these politicians enough data. And if they had more data, obviously they would come to the right conclusion. So they gave these politicians 3 times, and in some cases 5 times more data, and the effect got worse. So armed with more data, really smart people engaged in motivated reasoning are even better at aligning that data with their pre-existing positions. So this, I think, is just a fantastic example of how a small, right, this is like 4 words of difference between the left-hand side of the screen and the right-hand side of the screen. Small framing choices lead to dramatically different effects that our information can have. And Marissa and I have talked for a long time about how framing matters, but I think over the last 2 years, we've become kind of particularly attuned to the importance of the choices that we make and how we say what we have to say. And I've been collecting examples that kind of range from really obvious and ugly examples to more kind of nuanced and, in my opinion, more interesting examples. And I just wanted to show you 3 of these again, just to drive home this idea of framing and show you what it looks like. So most obviously, back to the beginning of the pandemic, was this, I would argue, very deliberate choice in framing around talking about the coronavirus as the Chinese virus. And we saw both immediately how that choice of words activated a sense of racism, a powerful way of othering, that not only affected how people thought, but as the pandemic continued, actually had, I would argue, kind of life and in some cases death consequences for groups of people. So these choices are, in some cases, incredibly significant and aren't just about thinking and ideas. They're about violence and action in our world. Kind of moving to, that's a pretty in-your-face one. Kind of moving slightly more nuanced, we saw a lot of this coverage around kind of workforce and labor dynamics, in which a lot of women and mothers in particular were leaving the workforce. And we saw this language around mothers choosing, and choosing, I would argue, is the verb that really matters in this case, to leave the workforce in record numbers. And what this does is it creates an incredible degree of contextual blindness, right? It allows us to hold women uniquely responsible for these choices without seeing the larger context, the larger influences, the larger pressures and stresses that are forcing this decision, and activates some very available and significant gender stereotypes. And I would argue that all of that is from one verb, one word in that message that you see on the left-hand side of the screen. Now, I think kind of most nuanced, but to my mind, most interesting, is all of this coverage that we've been seeing associated with various groups of people, whether that's people of color, kind of disproportionately being impacted by the pandemic, or older adults, all this language around vulnerability and our duty to protect them, those people who are vulnerable. And there's really good research that both we have done and other social scientists have done that show clearly that when groups are consistently labeled as vulnerable, it allows us, it invites us to other those groups, to draw a significant difference between us and them, reifies stigma, not only kind of stereotypes and stigma that we hold of groups of people, but actually influences the identity and kind of the self-perception of people within those groups. And I would invite you all, I chose this one in particular because I think this has some really significant implications for how we've talked about young people, not just during the pandemic, but for a very long time, and how these choices of vulnerability, at risk, in danger, how these choices not only kind of further concretize our stereotypes of young people, but how they may actually affect the identities and the self-perceptions of people who are in that group about which we're talking. So I've come to use this idea, this metaphor of a key to think about framing, that the choices that we make and how we communicate, how we say what we have to say, have the ability to open up conversation. They have the ability to create space for people to think and talk in new and more productive ways about issues. They have the ability to open and increase people's support and willingness to consider new solutions. That's the good side, the optimistic side of framing. But as we just saw, that a key does the opposite thing, right? A key can lock things up. It can shut down conversation. It can turn people off. It can keep people from getting to the information, the ideas that we want to engage them in, and it can close down in very powerful ways, quick and very powerful ways, people's ability to think about solutions to the problems that we are trying to address. And so I want to just use the rest of my time to talk about kind of the two key principles that run through, that underlie all of the work that we do about framing, and I think will underlie kind of all of the content that we go through and all of the discussions that we have for the rest of our time together. And so the first of those principles, which I've already talked about a little bit, is this idea that understanding is frame dependent. And I realize that's kind of like wonky academic-ese. It sounds like something that someone with a PhD probably once said. And in fact, it is. This is kind of a quote from, paraphrased slightly, from one of the founding researchers, a guy named Shanto Iyengar, who kind of started this field of framing research. And I've come to think about this idea in a way that to me is more useful, as slightly less kind of wonk, 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 is that it's not just what we have to say that matters, but how we say it that is of consequence. So I'm not going to stand up here, sit down here today and say that everything that you know about adolescent development is inconsequential. But I am going to say that if you want that information, if you want what you know to have the effect and the impact that you think it can, you have to be attentive to the way that you frame, the way that you position, the way that you advance that information, the choices that you make in how you say what you have to say. And again, I'm going to give you a really quick example that I think drives this home and really makes the point in a clear way around the importance of these decisions. So in addition to the work that Andrew and Adriana talked about, that we've been in partnership with them and other colleagues with for the last, I don't know how long it's been now, 5 years, it feels like forever, for the last 5 years. We've done a lot of work over the years. I've been doing work on early childhood and kind of framing the science of early childhood for almost 15 years now. And one of the key areas of the science of early childhood, which has kind of been particularly pernicious and hard to frame, hard to get people to be open to and think productively about, is the idea of early child mental health, that young children, that very young children can even have meaningful states of mental health, and that it's important that we have policies and interventions and programs that address and support that mental health. And so what I'm about to show you now is one experiment that's part of a much larger body of work in which we were tasked with addressing that issue. Kind of, can we and how can we frame issues of child mental health to make people more open to and willing to support the kinds of policies and interventions and programs that evidence suggests are effective in improving, in creating kind of positive mental health. And so in this case, we were testing 2 different values frames. The values frames are what you see along the horizontal axis at the bottom of the screen. The way that this works, so this is a large nationally representative sample of Americans, about 6,000 people. The way that this works is each of those 6,000 people logs on to an online site, an experiment, and they get randomly assigned to one of 3 different groups. So 2 treatment groups and 1 control group. So the way that this works is Andrew logs on, he gets randomly assigned. I don't know why I always do that with my hands. That's like it's like the gesture of random assignment. Gets randomly assigned to the value, the frame of collective progress and social prosperity. So Andrew would read about 80 words that talks about a child mental health program. And at the top of that, the frame, the Q, the prime, is this value. So it would say something like, we need to do a better job of supporting children's mental health in this country because, and we wouldn't say it in such a hackneyed and cliched way, children are our future, right? Their positive development, their stable mental health are key to our ability to move forward successfully and progress and kind of experience progress as a country. Adriana logs on, again, this is random assignment, to the value of vulnerability. So she reads the same 80 words about the program, except the lead-in, the sentence at the top, is different. So instead of what Andrew read, Adriana would read, it's important that we do a better job of supporting children's mental health in this country because children are our most vulnerable citizens. They deserve our empathy, our compassion, and we must do better by them. And then there's a control condition who logs on. I'm going to put, I can see Olivia McDonald's name here. Olivia is the control condition. I'm sorry, Olivia, but you are the thin 0 line that cuts across the screen here. Olivia receives no message. And then everybody, regardless of which condition they were assigned to, answers a set of outcome questions that are designed to measure how supportive people are of that set of evidence-based policies. And so what you're going to see on this next click are what I think are 2 absolutely gorgeous green bars are going to appear on the screen. And what those bars are going to show you is the extent to which hearing those different messages affect people's support for these policies, these interventions, these solutions. And so you see 2 bars and you notice 2 things. First of all, they're gorgeous. Second of all, that collective progress and social prosperity value, the value that Andrew received, is having a strong, kind of statistically significant positive effect. It's making people more supportive, more willing to get behind, to endorse, to support those policies. You probably also noticed, as your eyes wander towards the right-hand side of the screen, that value that Adriana received, the value of vulnerability, is having the opposite effect. So not only is it it's not only 0, it's negative in a significant direction. So to translate that for you, if you're an expert or an advocate working on early childhood, and I would argue adolescence as well, you use the value of vulnerability to frame your messages. You not only waste your breath, waste your resources, waste your chance, you actually use that breath, those resources, and those chances in a way that directly disadvantages your goals as a researcher, as an expert, as an advocate on this issue. And so the story gets even worse, or or better, I'm not sure, a better story, but more depressing. In a piece of research that we did after this experiment, where we systematically sampled all of the field's external facing materials, so those organizations that are communicating about early childhood mental health, guess which value we found to be the dominant frame in over 85% of those materials. So if we were in person, everyone would scream vulnerability, but this has to be a rhetorical question because of our Zoom format here. So vulnerability. And what that means, in essence, is that for a very long time, unintentionally, of course, with a lot of resources, the field had been advancing a value that, again, not only wasted their resources in space, but used those resources in a way that worked against their goals as researchers and advocates. So the second idea that I think is really important to keep in mind, which is going to connect to some of the content later, is that when it comes to communicating, when it comes to us as experts on issues, communicating with people who are not experts on issues, there is a challenge, and we all have a problem. And it's a problem with communication. If we're being honest with ourselves, each and every one of us has been in this scenario, in this situation that you see on the screen right now, where we think we have the most brilliant way of talking about peer relationships among adolescents. And we try it with two of our closest colleagues who happen to be experts on peer relationships in adolescence. And these ideas work great. They resonate for people. They get us moving in the same direction. And then we try these brilliant strategies on people on normal people, right? People who don't live and eat and sleep and breathe the science of adolescence and adolescent development every day, all day. And we find out that they aren't, that they aren't as brilliant as we think they are. And one of two things happens. They either kind of go in one ear and out the other. They don't land, they don't have traction, whatever we want to say, or they send people kind of running and moving in the exact opposite direction, a phenomenon that's become known as a backfire effect. And I want to give you a very short example of what this looks like. Again, kind of going back to some of our work on early childhood, just because I think this crystallizes the concept in a really productive way. So folks in the field of early childhood and in the field of adolescence really, for good reason, want to talk a lot about stress and adversity. And they say things like what you see on the left-hand side of the screen. This is a direct quote from a developmental scientist who said that persistent stress can derail development and have negative long-term effects on health and well-being. So I said it was a direct quote. I made one editorial change. In the original quote, the word negative was deleterious. And I've changed that to be just a little bit less obnoxious and obvious in the point that I'm about to make. But for people working in the field of early childhood, this is like really true. Truthity true, all the way through true. Lots of science, number of disciplines over a long period of time. The problem is that when this kind of a statement goes out to people who are not experts in the science of early childhood development, and I hope this works here. I'm not sure I pressed the boxes. You may not be able to hear this. Let me know, Adriana and Andrew, if you can hear this. If not, I've seen this video probably about 672 times, and I can reenact it for you.
Turn it up.
I can't turn it up.
No.
You must not be able to hear it.
You can barely hear it.
Okay.
There's been people that have come from absolutely nothing to make it whatever society's eyes deem success.
Okay. So basically what he's saying is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I know a lot of people who have come from nothing and have made it. And that adversity, I'm even doing his voice without trying to. And that adversity is the thing that makes us who we are and creates strength and resilience. And if you could have heard it, it is like absolutely crystal clear that what he is saying is different, is not the intended effect that this expert had when he or she opened his or her mouth to deliver this message, and that there's something going on between the delivery of the message, the intention, and its actual effect. And we would argue that thing, not to leave you on the edge of your seats for a split second longer, is culture, right? Culture, not the kind of Indiana Jones external artifact archaeology kind of culture, which is what my parents still think I do to this day, but rather culture in mind, culture as a set of shared mental models, of heuristics, of patterns of reasoning, of assumptions that we all have and that we walk around with us in our heads that become activated and cued based on the information that we receive. So what's happening is there's some cue on the left-hand side of the screen, stress, that activates a mindset that we all have and that are particularly dominant for certain groups of people. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger, which then shapes and constrains people's thinking on the outcome. And there's this wonderful quote. It's my favorite quote about culture. Unfortunately, it does not come from an anthropologist. The JFK way back in 1962 had this wonderful quote about, he didn't say culture, but he's basically talking about culture and mindsets when he said, the great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. So it's not like that guy in the baseball cap that you couldn't hear hates kids and is out to do them wrong, but rather he has a myth, a mindset about stress and adversity that gets in the way of him accessing that information. And so I'm going to end with a quote that I think is a really helpful way of thinking about framing, and then I'm going to hand it off. So this is a philosopher named Richard Rorty who said that a talent for speaking differently rather than arguing well is the chief instrument of cultural change. And a lot of the strategies and the rest of the discussion that we have today with you is going to be about this idea of speaking differently, not engaging in rhetorical arguments, not trying to be the smartest person in the room, but in adopting and having a set of strategies that you can use to position information and speak differently about the information and the findings that you have, such that they can be heard and accessed and used by the people that you're communicating with.